Hey there, and welcome in to this joint live stream, getting you all prepped for Kentucky at South Carolina this Saturday. I'm Jordan Kaye, covering South Carolina for the State. He is Jon Hale, covering the Wildcats for the Herald Leader. And we've got two right now kind of mediocre SEC football teams, John, meeting in Williams-Brice Stadium. I think the big thing, the big news out of this game is what's going on with this Kentucky quarterback situation. They brought in what felt like 20th year senior Zach Calzada earlier this season, and he's not starting. I mean, what's going on right now with Kentucky's quarterback situation?
Yeah, I was going to make the joke that these two teams, I think Kentucky's right where we expected them to be record-wise. They handled the two kind of mid-major teams they played, lost to Ole Miss. South Carolina obviously has had their issues in terms of as a team, but the way Kentucky got here is not at all what we expected. I mean, I did a bold predictions article before the season, and one of them was that Zach Calzada was actually going to start every game. So it's always great when you miss one of your predictions by week 3. So there's a couple things going on. One, he just wasn't very good in the first 2 games when he started. The reason you sign a 7th-year senior with SEC experience is you hope he's going to make all the right decisions. He's going to make the right reads. He's not going to force plays. He's not going to have bad turnovers. And in that first game against Toledo, took a safety in the end zone on a play he was supposed to hand off to the running back. They never discussed any scenario where he was going to keep it, kept it for some reason, got sacked or tackled for a loss for a safety, and threw a terrible interception. Week 2 against Ole Miss, he didn't have any interceptions, but there were probably 2 passes in that game that should have been picked off. So he was not making great decisions. Then with late in the fourth quarter against Ole Miss, he chucks it down the field on a 4th down, kind of a desperation Hail Mary play, and immediately comes up wincing with something in his shoulder. It was unclear how hurt he was in the moment, but Mark Stoops basically said on the sideline, if he's limited at all, let's just go to Cutter Boley, the backup, and go from there. Cutter played the last 2 drives against Ole Miss. Didn't have much more success than Calzada had, but then Calzada was limited enough the next week, and he had struggled enough that it was basically like, okay, let's give Cutter Boley this chance against Eastern Michigan, probably the worst FBS team they're playing all season, see if he can build some momentum. Calzada wasn't practicing anyway, and Boley was good enough in that game that there really was no other option for them to play than to play Cutter Boley moving forward. We don't really know what Calzada's status is. He was listed as the backup with an with a senior walk-on as the other number 2 guy this week. Stoops would not really elaborate on that when I asked him. So it's unclear if Calzada is available in an emergency situation, if he's available just normally. But Cutter Boley, who they have long described as the quarterback of the future, is the quarterback of the present for now. And if he's good enough, moving forward, he'll just keep the job.
Yeah, I mean, in the 3 games Kentucky's played, granted, really only one of them was against decent competition, but averaging almost 32 points a game, which isn't incredible, but it sure looks better than where South Carolina's offense is now, which is right above 22 points a game, despite coming into this season thinking that Lenora Sellers had the chance to be in New York for the Heisman ceremony. And it's kind of interesting. It's the team, one of these teams has a quarterback problem, and yet both offenses are kind of in this flux. In South Carolina right now, coming off back-to-back losses against Vanderbilt and Missouri, is kind of in this offensive identity crisis. They're coming off a game where they rushed for -9 yards in a loss and somehow still had a chance to win, which is somewhat of a testament to how their defense played in the red zone. But it's kind of interesting that we're talking about, hey, the quarterback of the future in Cutter Boley, because this is kind of, South Carolina thought Lenora Sellers right now was the quarterback of the present and has 5 sacks last week against Missouri. A lot of those sacks just were on him. I mean, you can blame the offensive line a little bit for him. You can blame sometimes his protection from the running backs and the tight ends, but there were a number of times where he had the opportunity to just get rid of the ball and didn't do that. And that's kind of something that worries, I think, South Carolina fans going into this game against Kentucky, because theoretically, I mean, this Wildcats defense is not unbelievable. I mean, they're giving up 23 points a game, but if you remember last year, this was a defense that really got after Lenora Sellers. Granted, it was very early in his college career, But the offense only put up 24 points. If you remember in that win, there was a pick six, kind of made the score a little bit bigger. But I remember they were getting after Sellers on the outside, and he fumbled a number of times. I believe it was at least two, and just kind of had some crazy lucky bounces, was able to fall on the ball. And I think that game could have gone a lot differently. So, John, I mean, can you kind of take me through what do you think Kentucky's defensive plan is going to be against South Carolina and against Sellers? Because it was solid, last season, I thought.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up that game last year because from the Kentucky side, from their fans at least, the perception that was week 2.
Yeah,
kind of embarrassed. It was a terrible performance for Kentucky, and it was kind of like the sky was falling basically because Kentucky fans, at least at that point, thought Lenore Sellers was just not good, and so they were like, "This guy's terrible," and we lost to him. Obviously, the way the season played out, we found out that he was actually really, really good, one of the best quarterbacks in the league. And South Carolina was a lot better than Kentucky fans thought going into last year. So that loss didn't look quite as bad in the long run. Their defense, though, was pretty strong for the first half of last season. They had two, kind of early round NFL draft picks who were both healthy at the time. Deion Walker, the defensive tackle, and then Maxwell Hairston, who ended up being a first round pick at cornerback. That certainly helped. And as those guys got banged up later in the year, Kentucky's defense got way worse. There just wasn't much depth, and it got exposed in the second half of the season. So it's easy to forget, even from a Kentucky fan perspective, how good they were early in the year. And this defense this year looks kind of similar to how they played early last season. They were not great 2 weeks ago against Eastern Michigan before their bye. Some of that was, I think, playing some young guys, trying to get them some experience. They probably let up the gas a little bit after they were in control of that game, so it skewed the stats a little bit. They played great against Toledo, who's the preseason MAC favorite. They played really well against Ole Miss for the second year in a row. They won in Oxford last year, limited them as much as really anybody has all season this year. So I think the defense is good. It starts up front with a couple transfers they added. David Gusta, nose guard from Washington State. McQueese Humphrey Grace, defensive end from South Dakota. They added some edge rushers. Sam Green from USC, and a couple other guys they have back. Their interior linebackers are really good. That picture we just saw, Daverin Rayner chasing Lenore Sellers there. He actually ended up redshirting last season, but now he's kind of their heart of their defense, middle linebacker, Alex Afari, a guy who moved around a lot at the different positions, has been great through the first 3 games. That front seven looks pretty good. They've got some questions on the back end, and they need to figure that out. But I think they can get more pressure just by rushing forward than they've been able to do in a couple of years, which is good for them because they need some help. They don't want to put these guys in one-on-one situations. That, my guess, is the vibe this week, the plan, get some pressure on Sellers, force him to make some bad decisions. I do think they anticipate he's going to run more than he has thus far this season. They're trying to prepare for that. They've had trouble with that, as most teams do with rushing quarterbacks at various times. How limited do you think he has been by the head injury he got 2 weeks ago? How much has that affected him?
I really don't think it's affected him much, if at all, which is almost more concerning for South Carolina because this is a guy, if you take out the sacks, only rushed 5 times against Missouri. And if you look at scrambles, he only scrambled 2 times. So it is like he's almost just standing in the pocket. And, if things break down or if it's not there, he's just holding on to the ball and taking those sacks, which is really concerning right now for South Carolina's offense because anyone who watched Sellers last year, whether it be the Kentucky game or you go later in the season against Clemson, what made him so good, what makes him so good is his ability when things break down, the pocket collapses, his reads aren't there, is that he can do these Houdini Superman type plays where he somehow gets out of a sack or finds a hole, is able to kind of get it upfield, get some yards, maybe a first down. And those are the back-breaking plays that defenders always talk about when they play Sellers is like, you just do not want to get beat on those things. And I think opposing defensive coordinators have probably watched that Clemson game plenty. I mean, Missouri at some points had 2 spies on him. Clemson, if you go back to it, had 1 on some of those plays. And so they have 2 spies and they're really just not letting him do anything. But it also helps that, this offensive line has not been able to hold up. And so these defenses do not have to blitz. Missouri blitzed 4 times in the entire game. So they basically just rushed 4, dropped 7. Sometimes they rushed 3, dropped 8. And we're still able to get pressure on him. And at that point, just kind of daring him, like, if you beat us, in coverage, if you can throw a perfect pass, you beat us. And there were times, I mean, he did. He still finished the game 18 to 28, had over 300 passing yards. And there were a couple plays. I mean, if he goes in the draft this year, a couple plays from that Missouri game are going to make the highlight reel where he's hitting receivers in stride deep down the field. Then there's a couple others where, late in the game, he's got guys on a crossing route. I think it was Vandravius Jacobs on a crossing route. Could have set them up maybe, down the field, could have had a winning touchdown. But there's a little pressure. It seems like he can't get the ball out exactly where he wants it, misses a throw. There's another one in the first quarter where Mazeo Bennett is wide open. I mean, no one within 15, 20 yards, and there's pressure, and the ball just isn't perfect. Probably still could have been caught, but not there. And so it's interesting how Missouri was able to just basically not rush many, still get home and be able to drop a ton of guys. And it sounds like that's kind of what you think Kentucky's going to do is, hey, let's not blitz a lot. Let's hope we can get pressure with 3 or 4 and sit back and make Sellers beat us.
Yeah, that's generally their defensive philosophy most weeks. I mean, their defensive coordinator, Brad White, gets a fair amount of criticism locally sometimes for not being aggressive enough. And they are perfectly content. Like, if you watch how they play Ole Miss both this year and last year, they're content to let you have dink and dunk down the field a little bit and just try and limit the explosive plays. That's their whole strategy. It didn't work great against Ole Miss this year because they couldn't tackle those guys on the perimeter, which is a problem. You have to do that when you're going to give up those yards. So, yeah, I certainly think until they're forced to do otherwise, they will try and limit those big plays at the cost of maybe bringing extra pressure on Sellers. That's generally how they play. It will be interesting to see the injury report, the availability report come out tomorrow night on Wednesday. Their number one cornerback, DJ Waller, who's a former Michigan transfer, missed the last 2 games. His backup, Ryan Nichols, who they kind of consider a co-starter as a 3-man rotation there, also was limited in the last game against Eastern Michigan. Mark Stoops said yesterday on Monday at his press conference he thinks both those guys are going to be back, but that will be worth watching all week because they really got exposed in the secondary against Eastern Michigan when they were down to their 4th, 5th cornerback. If they are playing those guys this week, Sellers is going to have some opportunities for big plays down the field, and it will be interesting to see if Kentucky can do anything schematically to limit that. I'm interested in South Carolina's defense too. Like, I was going back, I had this memory of that game last year of Dylan Stewart just kind of like completely wrecking the game. And in the stat sheet, he only had 1 tackle for loss, 1 sack, but they had 5 sacks. They had 11 tackles for loss. That was the game we figured out Kentucky's offensive line was really, really bad. And now Kentucky's offensive line is almost completely rebuilt from the transfer portal. They added 3 new starters and their top backups, a transfer addition. Those guys have been good so far, but they have not faced a challenge like they'll face against Stewart in South Carolina this week. So how do you think those guys have looked so far, that front 7 for South Carolina?
Yeah, Stewart's kind of a lightning rod right now because he was very, very good in the Virginia Tech game. And then, as SEC play started and he goes against Vanderbilt, the Commodores just had the game plan of let's just run away from him. So sometimes in pass pro, sometimes he was just getting beat, one-on-one. Sometimes they were double teaming him. And then on run plays, they were just kind of going away from him. And they basically neutralized him. I mean, it was really impressive. And that kind of set a blueprint because then you go into the Missouri game. His name just wasn't called that much. I mean, he was not a massive factor. Let me look at the stats here. He was not a guy who was called on a lot. He had 4 tackles, no tackles for loss, no sacks, no quarterback hits. Just didn't really make too much of an impact. And I think that's kind of a scary for South Carolina is they don't last year. They had Kyle Kennard opposite him being able to rush the passer. And so a lot of these offensive lines kind of had to pick their poison. Hey, do we want to, go after Stewart or Kennard? And basically both of them were so good. I mean, one was often, able to get to the quarterback. And this year there's not that guy opposite Stewart. And so teams kind of just can throw a lot of resources at him. And he's been a guy who just sometimes has trouble with his emotions and kind of got flagged last week. There was kind of a soft roughing the passer call, which I didn't agree with. But then there was another one where he gets called for unsportsmanlike conduct. And it's like, that was a stupid thing. He goes and pushing offensive linemen in Pavia. And it's like, dude, what are you doing? And then kind of gets into a little thing at the end of the Missouri game. And so it's like the frustration, it seems like, is building for him. And there's no one else really around him stepping up to being able to do that. And so that's a little bit of a problem right now. But can you kind of take us through? Well, first of all, we got a question from our guy, Chapel Fowler. As former Clemson wide receiver Troy Stellato been playing at Kentucky? Is he making any impact?
Not much. I think he's returned a couple punts. He had a play in the first game where he had a really bad drop against Toledo, and it seems like he hasn't played a lot since then. It's an interesting question though from Chapel, because Kentucky's wide receiver room is probably the biggest question on this offense. Like, even with the quarterback uncertainty, you lose Danke, who was a true number one option, transferred to Nebraska last year. You lose Barryon Brown, who did most of his work as a gadget guy and a kick returner, maybe was overhyped as a wide receiver. He's at LSU now. And so the only guy they have back really who played a lot last year is Jamori Macklin, and he barely played in the first half of the season at all. Kind of came on down the stretch when those other two guys were hurt. And when your offense is as bad as Kentucky's was last year, to be clear, they did not score more than 20 points against a Power 5 opponent all season last year. That's really, really bad. It's going to be hard to go out and get the top level wide receivers in the transfer portal. I think what they hoped were they found some guys who, had some rough edges, but you could kind of see around and build something around them. Troy Stellato being one of those guys, former top recruit. They recruited him out of high school, showed some promise at Clemson, but was hurt basically his entire career there. Kendrick Law, they got from Alabama, showed some promise at Alabama, actually started games for Alabama, also battled some injuries. J.J. Hester, who was at Oklahoma and Missouri before that, big play threat, was hurt a lot. And so you had to get these guys with some blemishes and hope it all clicked. 3 games in the season now, it kind of feels like maybe those guys just aren't very good. And that's the problem, is they have not found – that was it was a storyline throughout camp that they did not have a true number one receiver emerging. It was going to be a committee approach. It now appears that was not because there's this great depth in competition. It's because they haven't found a guy yet. Kendrick Law is their best hope for that, and he plays in front of Stellato, which probably limits his opportunities too. But they just haven't thrown the ball enough to really get any of those guys involved. Certainly this week with Cutter Boley making his first start on the road in the SEC, I'm going to guess that they're going to try and run the ball as much as they can and limit his opportunities. And so those wide receivers, I don't expect Stellato to be a huge part of the game plan this week, but certainly I would be shocked if any of those guys have more than 3 or 4 catches.
And you bring that up. This is a Kentucky rushing attack that's averaging over 200 yards a game. And I imagine they just have to be licking their chops after watching Missouri rush for 285 yards against South Carolina. It seems like there's the 2 guys, Seth McGowan and Dante Dowdle, both averaging over 5 yards a carry. I mean, what is this basically a true 2 running back set? I mean, what do these guys bring?
Yeah, it's really kind of the first year that Kentucky has had that kind of 2 running back approach since really 2016, the year that Stoops kind of turned this around. They had Benny Snell as a freshman that year and Boom Williams as a junior. Both those guys rushed for 1,000 yards. Since then, Kentucky has been built around this power run game. Benny Snell, the all-time leading rusher in program history. Chris Rodriguez after him had a bunch of 100-yard games. Those guys were big power workhorse backs who carried it 25, 30 times a game at times, but they didn't have a lot of depth. This year, they're really building around those top 2 guys. Dante Dowdle, a transfer from Nebraska, who was good at Nebraska last year, and he had 600 yards, something like that, is the power guy. And then Seth McGowan is a fascinating story. Was a former 4-star recruit, signed with Oklahoma as a freshman. I think Shane Beamer might have still been on the staff when he was there in 2020. He got arrested his spring of his freshman year, so he played as a true freshman, and that spring got arrested with 2 other Oklahoma players on felony robbery charges. They originally were looking at decades in prison and ended up pleading down to a lesser charge. It was still a felony. He got a year of probation. He spent 3 months in jail while he was waiting on probation. And then after he got kicked off the team there, kind of spent 3 years floating around the hinterlands of college football. Didn't have a team at all in 2021. Ended up at a junior college in 2022 where they didn't let him play the first half of the season. Went to a second an NAIA school in 2022, then a junior college in 23. Then in 24, he lands back at New Mexico State and has this breakout year. And Jay Boulware, who's Kentucky's running backs coach and special teams coordinator, recruited McGowan to Oklahoma originally. They kind of reconnected. They were connected throughout his whole process, Boulware staying in touch. And this year, he had the chance to come back. He's a 6-year guy, proved to NFL scouts he can play at the top level of college football. And probably more importantly, more interestingly, he's a guy who's really embraced the mistakes he's made in his life and trying to use those to kind of not only help his teammates, help other people. I had a long sit-down interview with him right before the season, 30 minutes. Nothing was off limits, talking about all the mistakes he's made and how he's trying to help other people avoid those and make the most of this, kind of second chance he's gotten. And he's done everything they could possibly hope for so far. He looks like a star. So it will be interesting to see if that carries on against, SEC opponents. Dowdell was limited a little bit against Eastern Michigan. They held him out kind of as a precaution. He's supposed to play this week. But those two guys, we will see a lot of them on Saturday for sure.
How old is Seth McGowan?
Yeah, it's his 6th year. He was a freshman in 2020, so he's probably pushing 23. He's not as old as Zach Calzada. Zach Calzada's 7th year, so they've got several of those guys. If he gets to the last year, we're going to see those COVID guys hanging around on rosters, but Kentucky's got a bunch of them.
This might be the game in college football with the oldest running backs because we've got either 23 or 24-year-old Seth McGowan. For South Carolina, Oscar Attaway is on his 7th year. He's 24, about to turn 25, and then Rasul Faison, another 7th-year guy, is 25 years old. So these are guys who are basically older than some dudes in the NFL right now playing college football, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, you look at all these running backs, and like basically for both teams, like almost none of these guys are like homegrown dudes.
Yeah.
And for South Carolina right now, it spent the entire offseason talking about getting Rasul Faison, the Utah State transfer, eligible. Kind of was dealing with some NCAA stuff where they had some questions about his eligibility and when his clock started, going back to his time at Marshall in 2019. And then they brought Oscar Attaway back, who's a 7th-year guy, got from North Texas 2 years ago. But South Carolina's rushing attack, it's going to be interesting against this Kentucky front because this group has really just done nothing so far this season. I think they have like less than 400 yards rushing through 4 games, which, you can kind of take out some of those numbers with the sack totals, but that applies to every team in the country. Like it's not just a South Carolina thing. You go to the Missouri game, Oscar Attaway, 3 rushes for 7 yards. Matthew Fuller, who's a redshirt freshman, 2 rushes, 7 yards. Faison, 6 rushes for 5 yards. And it just seems like, these are guys who don't have the running style of McGowan, who can just barrel over dudes. I mean, he wants contact because he thinks he can win in contact. South Carolina doesn't have those guys. You go to the Missouri game, there was 22 rushing attempts. The entire team broke 1 tackle, the tailbacks and sellers, 1 tackle. And they're running in between the tackles, not breaking anything. And it's just kind of an interesting thing where these guys are so much better in space, but rarely do they get in space. I mean, you look at Faison. I think the best plays so far at South Carolina are when he gets involved in the pass game, little dump offs. He had 2 catches for 13 yards against Missouri. Oscar Attaway had a 14-yard reception. These guys are better when they're in space, but they don't see a lot of space. And I'm wondering, John, going back to that Ole Miss game, that's a team, a lot of people think is going to be one of the best in the SEC. I think Austin Simmons was playing, though, and that's been a little different quarterback thing. But how did Kentucky's front hold up against Ole Miss rushing attack in that game a couple weeks ago?
Yeah, they were pretty good. The Ole Miss situation is interesting for Kentucky because, like, for whatever issues they had in the second half defensive last year that they've had at various times, like, Kentucky has limited Ole Miss better than almost any other team. Like, it just, for whatever reason, their strategy seems to really work against that offense. Like, they obviously won in Oxford last year. They played 2 years before that in Lexington and lost on they played in Oxford and should have won the game, but had a late penalty that negated the game-winning touchdown. Both of those games ended up being Ole Miss's worst offensive performance for the entire season. So I don't know how much we can take from Kentucky moving forward. They were able to limit the run fairly well. They gave up at least 1 explosive run or pass to a running back on a 4th-and-1 play that kind of flipped that game. So that is the big thing for Kentucky's defense. Like, they are pretty good 95% of the time. But if that 5%, if there's 5 or 6 plays a game where they give up a big play, because the margin of error is so thin for them, because their own offense has struggled so much for the last 3 years, really, like they just can't afford to give up those big defensive plays. And it does feel a lot like we've seen this happen so many times for Kentucky, where the defense is great through 3 quarters and the offense just isn't doing anything. And there's just this moment where it kind of feels like it finally just wears down and they can't keep playing perfectly. They can't keep making these red zone stops or whatever. That is something they'll have to avoid a lot this week. And I think that it starts with Kentucky's offense being able to control the clock. Obviously, Ole Miss is built in a way to score so quickly it doesn't really matter how much you have time of possession. But this could be a game where it does help them a lot if they're controlling, 75% of the time of possession, having those long methodical drives where they can run the ball. That helps the defense a lot just by keeping those guys off the field.
And you mentioned a little bit, with the Ole Miss thing, but I think it stretches to this. This is not. I don't think either fan base really considers it like a real rivalry, but in some way it kind of has become like a point of tension for both fan bases. And that's going to be the case going forward with Kentucky and South Carolina kind of on each other's permanent opponent list. So at least for the next 4 years and probably well beyond that, these two teams are going to play every year. Just kind of been a weird rivalry. I mean, Kentucky won 2014, 15, 16, 17, 18. South Carolina wins one at the end of the Muschamp thing. Kentucky wins the weird COVID one where they score 41. They beat Shane in his first season. Then comes the offseason comment about the stupid sunglasses. And since then, South Carolina has won 3 straight. And Shane Beamer brought up today in his press conference, he said, like, you go back to, like the 2016 game, if you take out the COVID season, like no offense in this game has scored more than 24 points. So it's just very odd how the defenses just for almost a decade have played really well in this game, despite, different defensive coordinator, different personnel, all that type of stuff. But as someone who's probably been at all of those games, I think for you, can you take us on a little history lesson of this weird matchup and kind of how it's been historically, like the last decade and then the last 3 years?
Yeah, it's fascinating because the permanent opponents leaking this week before the official announcement tonight on the SEC network. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the 3 South Carolina got were the same that were leaked 2 years ago or whatever.
Yeah, Shane was even mentioning that. Yeah,
that was not the case for Kentucky, because there was a lot of talk 3 years ago that on that initial list, Kentucky and Tennessee were not on there because Tennessee obviously has so many, high-profile rivals that the Kentucky-Tennessee rivalry did not make the cut. For Kentucky, they still view Tennessee as their biggest SEC rival just because they played every year for the last 100 years, except for 1943 when there wasn't a season because of World War II. They obviously have not been very successful in that rivalry at all. I think they've won 3 times in the last 37 years. But it's a situation where they viewed that as a rival, but it felt like the SEC viewed Kentucky, South Carolina as Kentucky's top rivalry. I'm looking at it now. I think South Carolina leads the overall series 21-13-1, but that's kind of skewed because they won 10 in a row when Steve Spurrier was the coach. Kentucky actually never beat Steve Spurrier at Florida or South Carolina until the very last time they faced him in 2010, and then he retired basically the next day because he's like, if I can't beat Kentucky anymore, I guess I need to quit. But since then, since 2010, so the year Kentucky's 9-6 in the series, so it's been very close. They went on that stretch where you mentioned they won, I think, 6 or 7 in a row until the last 3 years. Yeah, it has been. No, you're still muted too.
Sorry, they won 5 in a row and then 7 in 8 years. Yeah,
and so it's been that kind of series where one team goes on a stretch for a long time, and now it feels like we're kind of in that stretch where South Carolina is dominating a little bit. Obviously, it has the last 3 years, even though the games have been fairly close. The Beamer Stoops part of it, though, is fascinating because clearly these guys have some animosity behind the scenes. I know before we started, you were talking about Shane was really complimentary of Mark today. Mark always says nice things about him too, but that sunglasses comment from SEC Media Days 2 years ago, it just was so completely out of character for Mark Stoops, who does everything possible not to make headlines and interviews. That it really was interesting. And then clearly Beamer just played it up even more after they won the game and put them back on. And the clip in the locker room where he directly says, like, they called us out for this, we need to celebrate now or whatever. I wonder how much of it goes back to what happened with Beamer at Oklahoma with Bob Stoops. Like there's clearly some sort of issue there that I think probably feeds into this. But the other part of it is it's a rivalry now because it's so important to both teams. Like these are two teams who are historically kind of in the middle to bottom tier of the SEC, who are competing to try and make bowl games, to try and build some momentum. If you're going to have a special season at either Kentucky or South Carolina, you got to win this game. Like there's really no scenario where it goes the other way. And I think that increases the pressure on both coaches. And certainly Stoops is a guy the last 3 years who has gotten a lot more heat locally. Is feeling that he knows he has to beat South Carolina. There was a lot of resentment inside the Kentucky program for all those years while they were beating South Carolina consistently, and they'd go to SEC media days, and South Carolina would be the dark horse pick everybody was talking about, where they were like, oh, this is going to be the year South Carolina's the team to watch, and then Kentucky would beat them in September and never get very much credit for it. So there was resentment because of that, and now they feel like even in these 3 losses, they were the better team in a couple of those years and did not win. So I think that has only added to the situation more. That's a great picture of Stoops looking angry and stewing on the sideline. That's basically, I think, how he feels about this series as a whole right now.
Yeah, I loved your point. I think I even brought it up, and maybe we even talked about it last year, of for both programs, like you cannot lose this game and have a good season. It just like basically doesn't really happen. And I think it's kind of, aside from 2010, I guess that's probably the only one. And that game, South Carolina fans are kind of still pissed off about that one because they beat number 1 Alabama and then lose to Kentucky. And that's always like a weird one of like, what happened with that? But it's always, I kind of like when this game is earlier in the season because it is such a good litmus test. I think right back to last season where both programs, it was like, we have really high expectations. And then you go into that game and South Carolina wins. And I mean, they are coming off that game of like every goal we have for this entire season is still attainable. Like we are, put whatever word you there, we're that, we are these, bad dudes on defense that can get after you. And we're almost making their identity off that Kentucky game. And then I think back of, 2 years ago, 2023, and it's played like the middle of November. And it just felt like so boring. Like, I don't know that either team really had much to play for. And it was like, what are we doing here? So to have this game right at the beginning or right at the end of September, Kentucky's coming off a bye week. South Carolina is heading into a bye week after this and kind of has the meat of their schedule. For South Carolina, I mean, this is a complete can't lose. You cannot lose this game. You lose this game, all of a sudden you're 2-3, you're 0-3 in the SEC, and your next 5 are at LSU, Oklahoma, Alabama, at Ole Miss, at Texas A&M. Like, there might not be a ton of wins in there if you start, 0-3 in SEC play. This game, I feel like there is so much pressure on South Carolina to win at home, to get an SEC victory, to go into the bye week feeling good. For Kentucky, coming out of a bye week, having only played one SEC game, still have a winning record. Do you feel like there is that level of pressure on them, on Mark Stoops?
I think there is. I mean, it's interesting because they also have a similar gauntlet coming up. After this, they're at Georgia, then they have Texas, Tennessee, Florida at home in October. So like those are like, that's a difficult run to go through as well. And it felt very much for Kentucky, for a team that was going into this with like, there are plenty of Kentucky fans who want Mark Stoops fired, even though he is the all-time winningest coach. He's on all the hot seat lists right now. To be clear, he is not going to get fired because his buyout's $38 million after the year. And in this economic environment for college sports, like nobody is paying that buyout to fire your all-time winningest coach. That doesn't decrease the pressure on him. And it felt very much like, for him to have any chance of swinging the momentum for this season, they needed to beat either Ole Miss or South Carolina in this first month. And obviously they didn't do it against Ole Miss. They fell short. They were competitive. It was a good game, but they didn't win. And so now it feels like this is the game they have to kind of win to have any hope to keep a fan base engaged and positive at all. Because by the time they have any more winnable games, even let's say Florida doesn't look great right now. They're going to be the underdog in every single SEC game this season, especially if they lose here. by the time that Florida game comes along, which will be their next like legitimate chance for a win,
Yeah.
everybody's going to be plugged into Mark Pope in the basketball season by that point. And nothing they do in the second half is really going to matter.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You talked about South Carolina's season last year. Like that's what, like, for as much as the animosity between Stoops and Beamer that we've talked about, like he has brought up multiple times, like, if you want to hope for a quick turnaround in this transfer portal era, like look at what South Carolina did last year. Look at what Indiana did last year. Like you can rebuild a roster. And that's kind of was the message all offseason. They went and added 30 transfers and 20, freshmen. Over half the scholarship players on the roster are playing for Kentucky for the first time this season. And they want to follow that same blueprint to be able to say, like, we can turn this around quickly. And this is the week. If it doesn't happen this week, I don't know that anybody's buying that that's happening at all this year.
But that's an interesting point because I was just kind of looking at this today. First of all, like, it's felt like South Carolina last season, like these are two teams that they need to hit in the transfer portal, like on a couple guys. Like you have got to go find a couple gems and really like knock it out of the park. And I looked at South Carolina last year. They really, like, if you're talking about hits, they hit on like 6 of 22, but those 6 were so impactful. Guys like Kyle Kennard and starters like Demetrius Knight, who was basically, the leader of the defense. You have 2 guys on the offensive line who played really well. That's not like even a great clip. I mean, what is that? That's less than, 25%. But the guys were so good. And then you look at South Carolina this season, they brought in 18 guys from the portal. And if you're looking at dudes who you're like 4 weeks in, like they got a guy. It's like the 2 linebackers in Sean Murphy and Justin, I think like Okoronkwo or something like that. And then you can kind of like go from there. And it's like you can kind of pick out a couple dudes who it's like, well, they're playing well. They're doing okay. They had a center, Nolan Hay, who seemed to be doing okay, but then got injured. There was another offensive lineman, Boaz Stanley, who's already moved around a couple times. Gabriel Brownlow-Dindy's been in the middle. He's been solid. They tight end Jordan Dingle's caught some pass, but it's like, okay, they really haven't hit enough. It's like they're 2 of 18 right now on studs. Like as you kind of run through it in your mind or think about it, Kentucky brings in 30 guys. Like if I were to look at Kentucky's starting lineup, like are half transfers? Like how many of these guys are actually like playing and contributing and like, for lack of a better word, like in Kentucky's world, stars?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously start with Seth McGowan at running back.
That helps.
Category. Dante Dowdell, the other running back, seems to be moving towards that category. Their left tackle, Shiaz Pete from New Mexico State, played great so far. Their right guard, Joshua Braun from Arkansas, been very good. The right tackle, David Wolschlager from Bowling Green, all starting. The wide receivers we mentioned earlier, 3 transfers there. None of them I don't think we can consider any of them hits yet. The front 7 guys we mentioned earlier, Gusta and McQueese, Humphrey Grace, those guys look good so far. So they're probably looking at that 5, 6, 7 range of like contributor starter level players right now. Whether or not they end up being good enough against the SEC competition is still the question, because so many of the transfers Kentucky added came from smaller schools. And the question was, okay, you went and changed your philosophy. You got guys who were proven veterans. You didn't go add the Brock Vandegrift's of the world, who was a former 5-star recruit who sat on the bench for 3 years at Georgia and turned out not to be very good. Like, you got proven production, but can they do it at this level? And we don't know that yet until they get into this stretch. So it's going to be fascinating to watch the next few weeks. You mentioned Jordan Dingle there, obviously played for Kentucky previously. They are throwing to their tight ends a ton this year. And that's really the only position they have any sort of offensive continuity so far. That Josh Caddis and Willie Rodriguez, their top 2 guys back, have been their leading receivers so far. They've looked great. Jordan Dingle was actually their most productive tight end in the last 4 years. He leaves. They lose their tight ends coach, the longtime recruiting coordinator, Vince Marrow, to Louisville, their arch rival. So that position, that turnaround has been fascinating. But what exactly is going on with Dingle? I mean, he didn't have any catches the first 2 weeks. He looks like he's been kind of involved the last couple of weeks.
He was, didn't really do much against, either Virginia Tech or South Carolina State. And then like South Carolina kind of had some injuries with its tight ends against Vanderbilt. And all of a sudden they started targeting him more. I think he might have even got the start. And there was just some holes in the Vanderbilt defense where Dingle got open, 3 catches for 45 yards. Then you look at last week against Missouri and had a big catch for 20 yards. The problem is, first of all, the passing numbers just aren't incredible aside from, the Missouri game. But Dingle also, I mean, the 2 tight ends, when you look at, I think it was the run blocking numbers for PFF, Pro Football Focus, Dingle and, their other tight end, Brady Hunt, were 2 of the worst run blockers that got graded out. And so I think that might be also a reason, maybe he's not being targeted as much. But he did play a lot more because they had a tight end injured, Michael Smith. So he has the ability to catch passes. But if you're looking at like a holistic tight end right now, I think he's not quite there, but so far has been their top receiving tight end. So that part's, I guess good for him. But, I think there's still a long way to go.
Yeah, that was kind of his issue at Kentucky too, because their offensive line was so bad last year. They needed those tight ends to help blocking a lot, and he was maybe the most talented receiver in that group. But they needed those guys to block more, and so his role kind of decreased last year. Which he actually entered the portal 2 years ago, and they convinced him to come back. And then I think it was kind of like, well, you still didn't throw me the ball, so let's try it again now. So that would be fast. I'm actually writing about that for Thursday. Like,
perfect.
Kentucky's finally throwing to the tight ends this year. It's a fascinating week to see that because Dingle left and they lost Minsborough, but that would be a fun storyline to follow this week too.
Yeah, let's do one thing and then get to our predictions. John, if Kentucky wins on Saturday at Willie B, what has to happen?
I think it's got to be another one of these recent games. It's got to be in the 20s, like a 2017 kind of game, 24, 21, something like that at the most. Like, this is just not a team that's built to score and win in a shootout. If Lenore Sellers is throwing for 300 yards this week, Kentucky's not going to win. Like, it's just not going to happen. So they have to make it ugly. They have to run the ball, control the clock, limit South Carolina's possessions, and then hope that Cutter Boley kind of lives up to the moment. He played in the second half at Texas last year when that game was competitive, looked really, really good. They didn't score any and he was in there, but it wasn't his fault. So he's got some experience on the road in the SEC, but how he handles the environment with Sandstorm and everything, that's going to be fascinating to walk this week. So he has to – I don't think Cutter Boley's going to win them the game, but he can't lose them the game, and that's going to be really important.
Yeah, I think for South Carolina, if they're going to win this game, they just have to be better in the running game, both on offense and defense. Defense, I mean, they missed 16 tackles last week against Ahmad Hardy. And this is a guy in, Seth McGowan, who we know can break tackles. And so South Carolina is going to have to be a lot better at just making sure, getting to hats to the ball, making sure he's on the ground, because if they do another thing like they did against Missouri, where some defenders thought he was down and he pops right out, like that is the stuff South Carolina cannot have. And then on offense, I mean, it has to find some semblance of a running game. It is not asking, hey, South Carolina's got to rush for 200 yards, got to rush for 150 yards, but it has to at least like make it a threat. It has to rush the ball at least good enough to where Kentucky can't just drop 8 and feel pretty good about itself. And so that's going to be an interesting thing. It's going to be kind of fascinating to see what wrinkles offensive coordinator Mike Shula does, because Shane Beamer, I mean, is not happy with this run game and know it's not good enough. And so it's going to be curious. I mean, they're going to have to throw, basically whatever ideas they've got kind of out there and try everything. So I'm interested to see what creativity they try and use, if they try and run outside more with some of these guys, or if there's ways, or if they just say, hey, we're going to run it. If it's not working, like, we're not going to force it. Let's just keep throwing it deep and see if Kentucky's guys are good enough in coverage. I mean, that's a good that's a possibility in this game. But I still think, with South Carolina at home, I think their backs are against the wall. I think Sellers is going to be the best player on the field. And that's a big enough deal. I think he showed enough in the passing game that makes me think I think South Carolina wins this one. I'll say 20-13. What is your score prediction, Mr. Hale?
Yeah, Kentucky has actually been better on the road than they've been at home for the last 2 years. It's crazy.
South Carolina was last year, arguably.
Yeah, they've lost 9 home games in a row against Power 4 conference opponents, which is ridiculous. It's one of the reasons that Mark Stoops has so much heat right now. I think if I if Cutter Boley were not making his first start on the road, I would feel much better about picking Kentucky. I know the people in that building are pretty confident this week, but I just can't pick them with a redshirt freshman making his first start in that environment. With everything South Carolina is going to be facing pressure wise. I do think it's going to be ugly, one of those games, but I probably pick South Carolina, let's say 27-21, something like that.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for joining us. For some more news, we've got the SEC kind of opponent. It's not even a schedule reveal. It's an opponent reveal. So you can see who South Carolina and Kentucky are playing for the next 4 years. So you can start booking hotel. Well, you can't even book hotel reservations. You don't have dates. So you're really just doing this for yourself. But appreciate you guys. You can catch all of his work, including the upcoming tight end story at the Herald Leader. He's Jon Hale, and I am Jordan Kaye. Catch everything South Carolina at thestate.com and go Gamecocks. Thank you guys for joining us. Appreciate it. We will do this hopefully next year. Thank you
for having us, guys.